William, thank you very much for participating at today's Adult Education Colloquium on adult skills, where certain PIAAC results were revealed and also the results of thematic studies, 10 of them, were presented. Would you share with us your general impression of the event?
Yes, look, I was very impressed actually by the range of research that was going on in Slovenia. I mean, from what I could see and what I could hear of the research that was presented, it was addressing a lot of the key issues I think that have been raised by the PIAAC data, and addressing a lot of questions that a lot of other researchers in many other countries are doing. And I think it's actually extremely good that this has been supported by the Slovenian government, because I think it's only by putting money in and that you actually stimulate the kind of research that is needed for PIAAC. And I mean, one of the things we often find with this kind of study is that while people invest a lot of money in the collection of data, they don't invest quite as much in the analysis and reporting. And I think from that point of view, I think it's absolutely fantastic what you've done.
Thank you very much. Actually, the questions that I would like to pose to you are related to your presentation. One of them is, for example, you pointed out that there are several factors influencing the results of the measurement of adult skills, such as educational achievement, age, parents' education, and so on. And since you have this international perspective, could you share with us what do successful countries that really go deep into these results, what do they do in order to avoid negative effects of these factors?
Yeah, I think in my presentation today, I mean, I was trying to emphasise that there are a range of socio-demographic factors that do influence performance in the tests such as PIAAC. I mean, in some of the cases, I think the fact that we see differences between groups with different characteristics is not actually negative. If you take, for example, the question of formal education, one would expect and indeed hope that people who had done tertiary education had higher literacy and numeracy than people who had, say, completed less than upper secondary education. But I think I mean, one of the main issues is are the education and training systems in countries actually giving those people who leave education with a relatively low qualification sufficient literacy and numeracy skills to actually manage and thrive in the societies in which they live. And I think the evidence is, you know, there are probably some countries that do that better than others. But I think that's really a question of improving the quality of the schooling system. I mean, similarly with age, I mean, there are a couple of countries, for example, Korea and Singapore, where we see huge differences between the performance of young people and old people. However, again, this actually can be seen rather positively, because I think what one's seeing there is the effects of one, educational expansion, and two, improvements in the quality of schooling over time, because what you're seeing is that the 60 to 65 or 55 to 65 year olds in Singapore and Korea have very low levels of education. They were born at a time when there wasn't much access to schooling, whereas the current young people go to have high levels of qualification, and also are in systems such as Korea and Singapore, where they've got high quality. So there again, I think you know, what we're seeing with age is a mixture of, you know, cohort effects when people were born, and the impact of biological aging. So again, it's an area in which the fact there are differences or don't necessarily pose problems. In fact, with age, you've probably got more of a problem if there's not much of a difference between the old and the young, which may actually suggest that, particularly, it may actually suggest that the quality of education is falling. I think the main, you know, the main issue people are really interested here is, you know, the impact of social inequality on scores, and as manifested by the fact that family background has a quite significant impact on scores, or on scores in most countries. And there, I think what one tends to see is that I think the impact of family background is actually mediated by a whole lot of other factors about inequality in society. And well, I mean, one sees, I think, the impact is less, for example, in the Nordic countries than some other countries. And they're countries in which you've got quite a highly homogenous society in which there's a strong welfare state with income redistribution, which reduces the level of income inequality. And so I think in terms of media, the reducing the impact of family background, that's a problem for social policy generally. It's both a question of educational policy and also labour market policies, inclusion, and policies relating to tax and transfer systems.
Great. If we go back to the population 50 plus, Slovenia is quite a phenomenon here. We have quite a big share of this population group with low skills. That's what PIAAC showed. And on the other hand, a lower share of people who are still active in this age, which is due to our policy in this field and so on, especially in the last few years, which means that there is actually a problem of how to stimulate, how to activate these people who are still young in a way, but with low skills and maybe even with less desire to participate in any additional education, training. Non-formal might be one of the options, as we heard today. Do you have any suggestions regarding this?
I think that's a very big. I mean, it is a big problem. I think one of the things that we do see is that certainly for the older population, actually participation in the labour market and employment, it actually has a positive effect on skills.
Yeah.
I mean there are obviously selection effects there that as well, but I think really in terms of a group that's left the labour market, it's really a question of, well, those people have got to see some benefit in doing something. So in a sense, they've got to have a motivation to undertake some further training, and I think it's a question of options being there for them, which I think is a question for the non-formal, informal, informal sector. But I don't think there are really any very easy answers in this area.
Yeah. And related to this, do you find from all this research that you have an overview of, are there any new vulnerable groups that you became aware of?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things probably about PIAAC is, what it does is it reveals that in all countries there's a group of the population which can be quite large in many countries that has quite low literacy skills. But these are people who are they're not illiterate in the sense that they just can't read or they can't write. Not that we test writing, but they can't read. They've got, in most countries, most people with what we call poor skills have the basic building blocks of literacy. They've got vocabulary knowledge. They've got knowledge about they understand the logic of sentences, and they can read sequences of text relatively fluently. It takes them longer to do these kind of tasks than people who are more proficient. But what we do see is that they do have difficulty really in effectively interpreting texts quickly. They lack the sort of automaticity that we come to expect of a proficient reader. So I think that's a positive thing. In terms of the groups with poor skills, one of the things that it's not so much that there are new vulnerable groups out there, though in some countries recent migrants are very vulnerable. Particularly, for example, in Sweden, recent migrants have very poor skills in Swedish, both in absolute terms and relative to the rest of the population, which probably I think reflects the source countries and the type of migration that's going to some countries. I mean, one thing we do see with the adults with low skills is that they're not really clearly differentiated from the rest of the population. I mean, most of them are employed. Most of them, they have higher chances of having low levels of education, but there are still people with poor skills who have high levels of education or have got secondary education. They mostly they've got greater chances of coming from families in which are disadvantaged backgrounds, but there are still people from relatively advantaged backgrounds that have poor skills. And I think, one of the things there is really trying to work out better ways of targeting those people, and also not just thinking that they're people who are excluded in some way, that there are people, for example, a lot of people who are in work who have poor skills, and that's a question, I think, of how does one develop workplace literacy and numeracy programs to help those help those people.
I really liked the idea today that things are not black and white, that it's the shades in between that are worth of our attention and further research, I would say. Well, PIAAC results were strongly related to the well-known fact that employers tend to invest into the education and training of employees that already have a higher educational achievement and a good wage and all that. So what is your view on how to stimulate and support not only the people who have low-level jobs, but also how to stimulate employers at the same time, because it has to be at the same, at all levels, actually, action at all levels.
Yeah. I think the issue of how to stimulate employers to invest in literacy and numeracy training for their employees with low skills is it's an interesting and important one. I think the main thing there is firstly to get employers to understand that there's some benefit in doing this for them, and I think that requires showing that, for example, that having employees with low literacy and numeracy may have negative effects on productivity and profits and things like that, and that by investing in improving these kind of skills among the employees, everyone stands to benefit. And I think there, in terms of my experience as an Australian, there was some work done a few years ago by the peak industry body, the representative of the employer associations on literacy and numeracy in Australia, and they did a piece of work which did actually show that low literacy and numeracy did have costs for business, and they actually did a really good job in trying to identify where those costs were. For example, in that it took more time for people to do things such as filling in forms that were required, that there was greater loss of production and greater waste because people didn't understand what they were meant to be doing and things like that. And I think that was really very positive, and that led them to think about, well, what can we do there? And they approached the issue from two sides. One was that it was a good idea to actually try and develop the skills of the workers, so invest in workplace training, and I think the Australian government also provided some funding to support workplace literacy and numeracy programs. But it also led to them thinking about the other side, about what can we actually do in terms of the literacy and numeracy demands that we're placing on people. I think not to dumb down or anything, but actually to make it stimulated people to think about, well, perhaps we should write rules and regulations in simple language, in clear English in this case. Let's design forms in ways that everyone can understand. Let's reduce the amount of forms, the burden on people. And I think that two-sided approach is probably a very good way, because to think about the issues. But this is one of those questions that's been around for 30 or 40 years, which no one seems to come up to with with a
really
perfect answer. But as I said, I think one of the first things is really to try and make ensure that employers come to an understanding that having people with low literacy and numeracy does have costs, and that there are things that can be done and that there will be a benefit for them by putting effort into improving their skills.
Right. In your closing speech, you pointed out that actually PIAAC round 1 and 2 measured numeracy, literacy and problem solving, and that this is just a limited number of skills that are really important for everyday life and work. Would you like to elaborate a bit further on that? Is in the coming years, we know that PIAAC will be run again in 2021, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Will there be any new skills measured, any innovations in this field maybe?
Yeah, I mean, the intent has always been to see PIAAC as a repeated study, and as you said, there will be we hope that there will be a new round of PIAAC that collects data in 2021-22. In terms of the kind of development work that we're doing at the moment, it looks as though the next cycle of assessment will continue to focus on literacy and numeracy, because countries really conceive those as important skills to assess, and also they're interested in having some information about change over progress over
Hopefully.
time. Hopefully, yes, for most countries, progress.
Right.
In terms of the kind of development work that we're looking at, I think that there's an interest in trying to get some measures of some non-cognitive skills or competencies, or whatever you like to call them. So there's a group at the moment of experts in the measurement of personality traits, non-cognitive skills, developing a potential module of questions that could be included in PIAAC, and I think that reflects a general interest, both amongst educators and also labour market economists and people in the role of non-cognitive as well as cognitive skills in economic and social development. The other kind of thing that people have been interested in is perhaps having a measure of ICT skills or digital skills that's not tied to problem solving as such.
Yeah.
Whether this is again something we're exploring, and the other area where development work really is taking place is actually trying to improve to some extent the questions relating to literacy and numeracy and ICT practices. I think what we've got at the moment is good, but the developments in this area are such that we have to continue to develop the kind of questions to actually reflect the kind of reading and practices that people do today. There's not a lot. For example, there's not a lot in the current questionnaire about reading digital materials, tweets, and things like that. So, you need to keep those kind of questions up to date. The other area in which we see developments is in terms of computer delivery, and there actually the kind of developments we're looking at are really to try and help the management of the process. Having a system which provides real-time monitoring of what interviewers are doing, and connects to people's survey management systems. And the other area is we're actually looking at trying to improve or update the numeracy assessment, which particularly to include more digital materials. At the moment, the numeracy assessment is really a pencil and paper assessment put on a computer in a sense. And what we'd like to do is at least develop some items which made much more use of the interactivity that you can have through a computer assessment, and perhaps use some sort of modelling and simulation tools to develop some interesting items. So
that's a lot, actually.
Yeah.
Great. One final question, actually. We tried at this event to show the close relationship between scientists, researchers, and policymakers. we are wishing for such a close relationship, and actually the representative of the ministry promised to create a meeting place of researchers and policymakers in some short term. Do you have any hints how to attract policymakers, gain their attention and keep it to the level of understanding and changing in real life certain things that are really crucial? Sorry.
Okay, no, that's again a good question, and I mean part of the issue is that the time of research and the time of policy are not the same.
No.
The cycle of research tends to be much longer than
right.
the cycle of policy. But I mean, I think one way of thinking about it is to try and have a regular dialogue where, on the one hand, policymakers can actually give researchers an idea of the kind of issues that they're dealing with, and I think researchers actually appreciate that, because they often don't understand the kind of issues that are occupying policymakers and why that's the case. So, I mean, I think the issue is trying to make sure that both sides gain something from the process, and I think by providing policymakers with an insight into what's going on. Providing researchers with an insight in what's going on in the policy process, I think they can be quite grateful for that and quite interested. And yeah, also, I mean, from the point of view of policymakers, having some idea about what the kind of things that people are doing in the research community is interesting. The struggle is always continuity in terms of the policymakers, but also I think it's it's important that any kind of dialogue is done within a framework where researchers have got to realise that they've got to present their findings in a way that can be understood by the intelligent the intelligent layperson,
right?
Rather than providing slides which contain lists of coefficients.
Right.
Yeah.
William, thank you for being with us, not only today, but throughout all these years, actually, and supporting our endeavours in this field. And we hope to continue with you together.
Yes, well, it's been my pleasure to be involved in PIAAC, and particularly with Slovenia. And as I said, this was a great opportunity for dialogue. And yes, I hope to be able to continue the relationship.
Great. Thank you very much.